I do have some potential good news. I teased it again on my Parler account before the show, where I do exclusive kind of heads up behind the scenes of what we're going to do. We may be looking at a big upset in 2020. You may say, Biden? No. Trump again. It was an interesting article I read this morning by Richard Lemon, the Washington Examiner. It's up in the show notes. Please read it. This is really important. If you want to get my show notes, go to bongino.com/newsletter. You can subscribe. It's an email. It's free. We don't spam your inbox. Don't worry. We'll send you these articles every day. I like to find the gems out there, and this is a good one. Richard Lim, July 1st, 2020. Are we being set up for another stunning Trump win? 2-pager. I got to go back and forth. There's so much information today. There's an interesting comparison between what's going on right now and a prior election in U.S. history that I had not considered before. Richard has a interesting historical perspective I think you need to hear about. Put up the first screenshot, if you don't mind, from that piece. This kind of sounds like, what I'm going to read to you is a quote from this Washington Examiner piece, and it sounds like Richard's talking about the election right now. Listen up, Joe, when I'm reading this. It sounds like, well, he's talking about now, right? No, he's not talking about now. Quote, with 5 months until the election, things couldn't look any worse for the president of the United States. His approval rating is down to 40%. People are getting tired of his antics and the insults he hurls at his opponents. The media is increasingly confident that come November, the voters will elect a new chief executive. Goes on. This may sound like June 2020, but Richard Lim's actually referring to June 1948. When President Harry Truman, a Democrat, was running to keep his job against Republican Thomas Dewey. Joe, everybody remembers the famous Dewey defeats Truman newspaper. Yeah. Who's holding up that paper in that iconic photo? Truman. Who won the election. They had already printed that. They were so sure Dewey was going to beat Truman that the headlines had already been printed on the newspaper. Dewey defeats Truman. Many of you have seen the photo. Truman actually holding it up as a joke because he won. Now, Truman was a Democrat, but a fascinating parallel. Truman's approval ratings were in the 40s. People thought his style was a little too brash, hurling too many insults at his opponent. People felt like it was time to move on. Sounds kind of like now, no? Well, Richard Lim makes an interesting comparison. He says there were two. Now, again, I'm out of the predictions business here. Especially now, because anything can change overnight, especially in 2020, which is officially the worst decade ever. And it just started. It doesn't matter what happens. 2020 is the worst decade ever. The 20s, worst decade ever. We're 6 months in. There we go. We're good. Well, actually, worst decade in the last 30, 40 years. Can't say ever. That would be an insult to the greatest generation, which has suffered, I argue, not even arguably, I should say, a lot more than we have. But going over this, 1948, check out this. Screenshot number two. He gives us two reasons why President Trump may be in better shape than people think. The first is political staying power. Prior to 1948, the Democrats had won 4 straight elections, the presidential elections. Many observers assumed that they were due for a loss, like they're assuming now, Joe. Trump, we've had enough of Trump, especially with the GOP's large gains in the midterm elections. Kind of like the Democrats' large gains in the midterm elections, right? Mm-hmm. The media, however, underestimated the strength of the Democrats' New Deal coalition. While commentators were thinking in terms of political cycles and party turnover, they failed to consider the New Deal's long-term appeal for its constituents. Again, although the ideological components of Truman's 1948 electoral win are completely different than Trump's now, the political staying power of a coalition who believes in something aren't any different. I think they are grossly underestimating that 45% of people who are behind President Trump no matter what. You may say, well, Dan, if it's 45% of people, that's still not 50. No. Don't make that mistake. That 45% of people is a poll. If that 45% of people becomes 60% of the electorate, then that's not 45% of people anymore. Don't mistake who answers the polls to who shows up at the polls. Don't make that mistake. I did a show on that. Polls of registered voters don't mean they're likely voters. Polls of likely voters taken in the wrong percentages doesn't mean that's the percentage of people in that potential likely voter pool that's going to show up that day. Here's the second reason they may be underestimating President Trump's support. People often vote for incumbent presidents based on intangibles, leadership skills, or likability, despite the candidate's flaws or policy disagreements. The Washington Post even alluded to this phenomenon after Truman's victory in 1948. The American people admire a man with courage, even though they don't always agree with him. The voters might give the opposing party control of Congress during the midterms to check the president, but they will still reelect a flawed incumbent because of their supposed charisma. See Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. I'm just telling you, folks, who knows what's going to happen, but be prepared for a potential big upset. Another reason I covered segment 1, and now I'm covering segment 2. These stories are tied together. They're not unrelated. If you're serious about winning, to the GOP folks, to the Trump administration, the Trump campaign too, it is time, and I know the Trump campaign takes this seriously, to create big, bold contrasts and stop worrying about the political correctness and the New York Times front page headlines about what you did. Stand for what is right, and people will see it in the long run. The American electorate is smart enough to figure this out. We are not the dunces the left-wing media wants you to believe. We have to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. Here is our contract with America, contract going forward. Here is what we believe in. Here's what we are going to fight for. We are willing to stand for it. We're willing to fight for it today if you will rep us.
You just heard Dan Bongino.